So for those of you who might not know, Trusting News is an organization that works to help people understand what kind of news is trusted and then turn that knowledge into day-to-day strategies for journalists that they can use in their news organizations. Since 2016, we've been working in what we call the cycle of learning with both academic researchers and newsroom partners to, again, kind of figure out what elements will actually help news organizations build trust with the public, and then how can we, again, take that knowledge and turn that into realistic, efficient strategies that journalists can implement in their daily coverage. Some of that work that we do involves helping journalists really understand the mindset and the challenges of the people who they're trying to serve in their community. We say this a lot at Trusting News, but we can't really work to build trust if we don't first understand what the distrust is. And so we're just going to take a minute to look kind of at the overall landscape of what trust in the US and the media looks like. So we know that trust in the media has been declining for decades. It's been declining pretty steadily since the 70s. It hit its very lowest point in 2016, and since then has rebounded just a little bit, but is still at one of the lowest points it's ever been at. The levels of trust differ really depending on the individual. So we know people who are younger tend to have less trust in news than people who are older. We know people who lean left tend to have higher trust in news than people who say they are conservative or right-leaning. And also the type of news matters. National news, people tend to have less trust in national news than local news. We also know that just most people have never even talked to a journalist before. So again, people can't really put a face to the name. People don't really understand, again, what motivates journalists, the mission behind what they do. People just don't really understand journalism as a whole. Just some research that kind of shows what people think of journalists' role in society. This research from Pew a few years ago shows that 46% of people think that journalists rarely care about people like them, and 33% think that journalists don't provide fair, accurate information to the public. This research was released by the Knight Foundation and Gallup just a few months ago, kind of looking at, again, people's perceptions of local and national news. And when they asked this question of how much do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements about local news, over 50% said that they either didn't agree or disagree or strongly disagreed, thinking that local news organizations didn't mean to mislead or misinform or persuade the public. So what's interesting about this research and this question is that it really gets at this level of emotional trust. Like, do people think that journalists are trying to do honest work? And while the numbers are better for local news organizations than national news organizations, overall, there's still obviously a lot of ground to be made up here. And then on top of that, we see that when there's just lots of confusion around the processes of journalism and how journalists do the work that they do and make the decisions that they make. I pulled out this example specifically about sourcing, anonymous sourcing, which is kind of one of these basic journalistic concepts, right, of anonymous sources. But this research from the Media Insight Project shows that 42% of people didn't understand what an anonymous source was, or they thought that an anonymous source meant that the source was anonymous to the journalist itself, which would be pretty egregious, right? If a journalist was just publishing content and interviews or sourcing from somebody who we had no idea who it was or was unvetted information. And what we see is when people don't understand and people don't understand the process of how something works, it leads to a lot of distrust then in journalism and how journalism works. So you can see the Pew research on the left, that the amount that journalists are using anonymous sources and the lack of knowledge on anonymous sources is really impacting people's trust in journalism. So again, we know trust is really low in the news. People don't really think that journalists are here trying to provide a public service or not necessarily acting out of good faith. And we know that there's a lot of confusion when it comes to the actual process of how journalism works. So that's where a lot of our work at Trusting News comes in, is to try to figure out, okay, what can journalists do to be transparent and help regain some of that ground and help earn trust with the public. And what we see is that in lots of different ways, the more journalists can be transparent about their processes and transparent about how their journalism works, the more that helps build trust with the public. So this is a screenshot of some research we did with the Center for Media Engagement a few years ago about when stories had these explain your process boxes that ran alongside them. So basically these were boxes that explained kind of the why and the how and the mission behind the reporting. It overall boosted people's perceptions of the journalist and the news organization and their trust in that news organization. So we know that the more journalists can explain how their journalism works, the more it helps build trust. So one of these concepts and processes, basic processes of journalism that we see a lot of confusion around is, again, sourcing and how and why we pick the sources that we pick. And it makes sense, right? Because this sourcing process varies a lot depending on who the journalist is, who the news organization is, what the story is, whether it's a breaking news story or an investigative story. Our sourcing process looks different across the board. We know that people assume that we choose sources. We hear this from partner news organizations as well as just across the board, that people really assume that journalists pick sources to push maybe a specific angle or to support an agenda or to maybe make one side of a story look good or make it look bad. They may also assume that people are just quoted in a story because they think they're nearby and available, which sometimes is true. Again, right? If we're maybe working quickly on deadline, maybe you are just trying to pick somebody who is the nearest and the most available to comment on the story. But we know through research and that people would find journalism more credible if they understood more about, again, the processes of how journalism works. And one of these processes, again, is how the process of sourcing works. So today we're just going to be talking through some of these different basic elements of the sourcing process that journalists could explain. And one of those is just explaining which sources that a journalist uses and why, plus explaining the sources that might not end up in a story or that we might not use. So this example from Science News is really great. They were doing a story about how certain types of cat food might alleviate people's allergies to cats. And when doing the story, I really loved how the reporter included this box alongside of it, just explaining why it is they picked the experts they chose to interview for the story. And they said, who did we speak to? Since this research is sponsored by a company with a financial stake in the outcome, I wanted to talk to an outside expert who had no ties to the research, felt it was important to get a clinical perspective. So I contacted an expert in immunology and allergies, right? So just really clearly stated why it was that they chose the expert that they chose to cite in the story. Here's another example from the Nashville Public Radio about how they acknowledge some missing sources in their story. So again, we know sometimes when there's a missing voice in a story, people can just jump to these automatic assumptions or conclusions that maybe journalists are purposely trying to mislead people or purposely trying to leave out a certain voice. So when the Nashville Public Radio was doing a story on police deadly use of force in the police department, they were missing some key interviews from some of the key people in the story, including some police officers involved. So they ran this box alongside of the story, just explaining how they reported it, what the reporting process looked like, that it spanned 3 years. They talked about that they conducted more than 15 hours of interviews and that they've reached out to this whole list of people, but they just never responded or declined to comment. So they talk about kind of the supplemental interviews and information that they used to try to make up for that ground since they couldn't get those voices. So again, just kind of explaining that it wasn't that they had an agenda or angle or trying to make the police department look bad. They just never were able to get interviews with these people. Here's another example of PolitiFact. Something great practice that PolitiFact has is at the end of every single one of their fact checks, they list out all of the sources that they use in their stories, whether that's information sources or people sources, including sources that might not actually be cited or quoted in the story itself. So I think that's really great too, that they clarify when it is that it's an email interview or in-person interview, again, kind of giving people a full picture of what that sourcing process looks like. And we love that because it's really great when people include these transparency elements in the stories themselves. We know that when people have questions about the reporting process or maybe don't understand something, it's unlikely that people will click out of the story onto a policy page or something like that. So it's best to just include these transparency elements in the story itself if you can. But it also can be really great if you do have a policy around sourcing, or if you do have a policy about how you interview or find information, to get on the record about that, both to kind of hold yourself accountable internally in your news organization and to invite the public to hold you accountable as well. So this is how PolitiFact has this on their about page about what their on the record sourcing looks like. So they talk about how they use on the record interviews. They talk about all the different ways that they source their fact checks, all the different Google searches they do, how they try to talk to a variety of experts, how they always try to contact the person that they're talking about in the story when they're doing a fact check about them. This is another example of what one of those policy pages can look like from the Colorado Sun. So something we hear from news organizations often is that they assume that either journalists pay sources or that sources are paying them for information. And so in this ethics page that they had, they just got on the record about their policy for that, saying, no, we don't pay sources. We don't pay subjects to shoot photos or videos of them, but they do clarify that, sometimes if somebody is a witness to an event and has a really great photo or video, we will pay for that information, or we might pay for a cup of coffee or lunch or something like that, but those types of things don't influence the reporting or don't influence the sourcing process. Another one of these basic things to explain about the sourcing process is how you choose which information to cite, including information beyond just the people who you talk to. So this is an example from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when they were covering a pretty contentious mayoral race. A couple of years ago in the city, they had a really great election landing page that went over lots of different elements of their election reporting, like their mission and their coverage area and what they're trying to achieve, how they're trying to include voter voices in their election coverage. But I really love this section where they talk about where they get their information. Again, people don't really understand all the different ways and all the different legal documents and things that you have access to as a journalist or just in the public. And so just getting really clear on the different ways that they were gathering information for their election coverage, like campaign finance reports, public records, public statements, polling, or conversations with voters. Here's another example of how the San Francisco Chronicle did this. So they have these really neat expandable boxes in their stories. So when they were reporting about how a new food delivery service came into town and was causing some disruption in the food industry, they got really specific about how it was that their reporters sourced this story, saying, they interviewed 6 restaurant owners, 4 delivery drivers, contacted 19 different restaurants. In addition, one of the reporters ordered food from 2 restaurants and got it delivered via this meal delivery service. So again, just got really specific about the different elements that went into their sourcing process. Another thing to talk about is explaining which information you decide to share about sources. So sometimes this could be like maybe you're reporting information about someone who was a victim of a crime, or maybe you're reporting personal information about someone that might not normally be included in a story, like someone's gender identity. Whenever those things come up, we know that the public has notices. And so it's best to just explain why it is that you're veering from the norm. One way that this comes up, obviously, is anonymous sources, which we talked about. People do not understand how anonymous sourcing works, thinking that anonymous source means that it's probably anonymous to the journalist as well. And so I'd like this example from The Graph, which is a student news organization, kind of put this almost like a warning or a heads up about the anonymous source in this story. They put this whole box above the link to the story in a newsletter that they sent out, just saying, hey, this article uses an anonymous source, and then goes into explain again why it is that they use an anonymous source, what the news organization's policy was for using anonymous sources overall. Again, we're really big fans of including that transparency in the stories or in the places that people are looking at your content, like a social post, like the story text, like a newsletter. But if you do have an overall news organization policy, that can also be a great place to link out to it. The Virginian Pilot did this when they had a story where they were using an anonymous source. They wrote a column just explaining why it was that sometimes the newsroom used anonymous sources, how they vet them, explaining why it was that they really rarely use them. And then in that story where they use an anonymous source, linked back to this column explaining kind of more of their processes behind it. Something else that we know there's lots of confusion around in the sourcing process is how we maybe try to reach a source and how we try to be fair to sources. This makes a lot of sense, right? A lot of times you'll just see in stories that someone says like, the source was unavailable for comment, but what does that mean, right? Did you try to reach out to the source 5 minutes before the story published? Was it 5 weeks before the story published? There's really no information there. And it again, probably varies based on the journalist and the news organization and what the story is. So this was a really great example of how a TV anchor, Phil Williams at News Channel 5, explained kind of how he tried to reach out to a congressman he was reporting on. So this congressman had raised a bunch of public money for this garden that then basically never came to fruition. And so as he was trying to find out, what happened to this money, and instead of just saying, the congressman wasn't available for comment, and then letting people kind of make assumptions that maybe he was didn't like the congressman or was pushing his own agenda by trying to make the congressman look bad, he got really clear about all the different ways that he tried to reach out to the congressman himself and to his office, even showing one time, like on camera, him walking up to the congressman and asking him questions as he got into a car, right? So really just showing all the ways he tried to reach out for an interview. Here's another similar example from WUSA when they were doing a story about the police department in DC. They were trying to get an interview with the police chief at the time of DC, and they weren't able to. And so in the news report that they did, they just showed actual screenshots of the text messages and the emails that they sent to the office and to the police chief trying to get on record. Again, also showed some video footage of them just showing up to the office trying to talk to him. So again, getting really clear of all the different ways that they tried to reach a source but weren't able to. And again, if you have a policy around this, it's great to point to that as well as including it in the transparency element in the story itself. So this is how the San Diego Union Tribune does this. They have this fairness checklist that they run their stories through. And one of the things on the fairness checklist that's public facing is that they try to give subjects ample time to respond, generally speaking, a minimum of 24 hours. So again, this could be something great that when they're writing stories in the future about how they tried to reach a source and maybe the source didn't comment, they could point back to this fairness checklist, point back to this ethics policy that they use and say like, hey, per our policy, we tried to give them over 24 hours to respond and they didn't, right? So kind of backing up that they're doing what they say they're going to do. Another element to really point to is how you try to diversify your sources. This is something that I think a lot of journalists and news organizations are trying to do better at, right? We recognize that we've not always done or ever done a really good job of inclusively or accurately reflecting our community in our coverage, both in who we're talking to and in our stories. In fact, some research from Pew shows that only 21% of people have ever even spoken with a local journalist, and that number goes down the less rich, white, old, and educated you are. So it really kind of paints a picture of who it is that journalists are talking to. And again, lots of news organizations and journalists are trying to do better by this and do some source tracking and things like that to have a more accurate, reflective coverage overall of their communities. But something that falls short is that a lot of times news organizations don't talk publicly about this or share publicly how it is that they're trying to diversify their sources. And again, we see that if we're not talking publicly about these decisions that we're making, that means those decisions are pretty much invisible to our audience, and they're not going to give us credit for trying, to work to diversify our coverage. So one example of how you can do this is from the Pittsburgh City paper when they are talking about how, again, they're trying to make their coverage more inclusive and reflective. They added this blurb about source tracking, about how they're committing to tracking the sources who inform their story. And their goal was to encourage a diversity of sources encompassing all ages, races, ethnicities, and all of those things. Here's another example from the Morning Call when they started using the Source Matter tools from the American Press Institute, which is a source tracking tool. They wrote a column about it, just explaining, like we're starting to use this tool because we are committed to trying to do a better job of source diversity. And that's why we're using this. And this is how we're going to try to keep an eye on who we're talking to and try to eventually improve that and diversify our sources more. And something else you can do in the sourcing process too is to not forget to invite your audience to also suggest sources. This can be a really impactful way to engage with your audience and include them in the reporting process and help them feel like their voice and perspective is valued and heard. This example is from WCPO when they're doing some reporting on automatic rifles and some gun legislation and things like that. They got a Facebook comment from someone who said, I have a specific request when doing stories about firearms. Like, could you speak to somebody more reputable, right? So they were kind of frustrated, this commenter. And the news director at the time, Mike Cannon, reached out and said, thanks for the feedback. If you have an expert that you think we should use, like, here's my email, please let me know. The other side of this is that commenter ended up reaching out to Mike, giving him some suggestions of experts, and then they end up using those experts in their reporting later on. So again, kind of showed that they valued the feedback from their audience and then allowed that to help them have stronger, better coverage of their community. So like we looked at a lot of examples today, there's tons of places where these types of explainers can go in terms of your sourcing process. So it could be just an editor's note that's at the top of the story or at the bottom in italics. You can put it in a social post, in the comments, in the social chatter. You can write a column if you have a standing policy, and then you can link to that from all your stories where you talk about sourcing, or maybe that a question about your sourcing process might come up. You can also do it in the newsletter itself on an on-air segment, or like I've been saying throughout, it's best if you can to just put it in the story itself. Again, that's where you have the most eyeballs on your content, is in the actual content you're serving to people. So if you can just insert it into a story or in the on-air segment, we see that overall is usually best and the most effective way to build trust with our audience.